On the 16th of October 1946, 10 men were led out from their prison cells into a makeshift execution chamber, and they each led up the 13 steps to the gallows. These were the most high-profile defendants at the Nuremberg Trials, those remaining members of the Third Reich's government, who were accused of some of the worst crimes of the 20th century. Amongst them were Joachim von Ribbentrop, the former foreign minister, and Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the highest-ranking SS officer. Each of the men went through the trapdoor in a rather bungled and botching fashion, with US Army executioner John C. Woods making a mess of the proceedings. A number of the men who went through the gallows did not immediately succumb to their fate, and they were left for many minutes dangling behind a curtain. In the aftermath of these executions, the bodies were placed on top of their coffins, which were very large wooden boxes, and they were then photographed. The coffins themselves even had handles on for the guards to later carry them to then deal with the bodies once and for all. What happened following the executions is not too well known about, and the preparations of the remains were rather rudimentary to say the least, and there was no embalming. The Americans who carried out the executions wanted these men rid of, and they dealt with the bodies in a very swift manner. Today we look at this, and to support our channel, please subscribe. The men of the Nuremberg executions were Joachim von Ribbentrop, the former foreign minister, Wilhelm Keitel, head of the German armed forces, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, chief of the Reich Security Main Office, Alfred Rosenborg, the chief Nazi ideologue, Hans Frank, the butcher of Poland, Wilhelm Frick, a senior Nazi minister, Julius Streicher, the infamous publisher of the anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer, Fritz Sauckel, responsible for forced labour programmes, Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the Reich Commissioner of the Netherlands, and Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff of the Wehrmacht. They were found guilty of crimes against humanity, war crimes and other offences, and the Nuremberg proceedings brought the truth about the Nazi atrocities to the world's attention. The executions were scheduled for the early morning of the 16th of October 1946, and they were to take place within the gymnasium of Nuremberg prison. There were 3 gallows in total constructed, all around 10 feet high, and the executioner, to speed up the process, would hang the defendants on 2 of the gallows, and the 3rd was a spare. There were a number of people inside the chamber who were there to witness what happened. One by one the men were brought out from their prison rooms, and they were then led into the execution chamber. Their identities were confirmed at the bottom of the gallows, and they were helped up the steps by guards, and they were also asked for their final words as they were handed over to the executioner. John C. Woods, the American hangman, as mentioned, did not perform the task very well, but it was said of the first execution, that of Joachim von Ribbentrop, that von Ribbentrop was able to maintain his apparent stoicism to the last. He walked steadily towards a scaffold between his 2 guards, but he did not answer at first when an officer standing at the foot of the gallows went through the formality of asking his name. When the query was repeated, he almost shouted, "Joachim von Ribbentrop," and then mounted the steps without any sign of hesitation. When he turned around on the platform to face the witnesses, he seemed to clench his teeth and raise his head with the old arrogance. When asked whether he had any final message, he said, "God protect Germany," in German, and then added, "May I say something else?" The interpreter nodded, and the former diplomatic wizard of Nazism spoke his last words in loud, firm tones. "My last wish is that Germany realise its entity, and that an understanding can be reached between the East and the West. I wish peace to the world." As the black hood was placed in position on his head, von Ribbentrop looked straight ahead. Then the hangman adjusted the rope, pulled the lever, and von Ribbentrop slipped away to his fate. The executions did not go very well, but one by one the men were sent through the gallows, and they were then left hanging. Woods utilised the standard drop method, and many of the men slowly strangled to death rather than having their necks snapped. Woods was incapable of bringing their deaths quickly, and he had botched things inside other prisons too, whilst carrying out executions, but his most high-profile job did not improve his reputation. The next man who was executed after von Ribbentrop was Wilhelm Keitel, the most senior military official inside Nazi Germany. It was said of his execution that officers and GIs walked around nervously or spoke a few words to another in hushed voices while Allied correspondents scribbled furiously their notes on this historic though ghastly event. In a few minutes, an American army doctor, accompanied by a Russian army doctor, and both carrying stethoscopes, walked to the first scaffold, lifted the curtain and disappeared within. They emerged at 1:30 a.m. and spoke to an American colonel. The colonel swung around and, facing official witnesses, snapped to attention to say, "The man is dead." Two GIs quickly appeared with a stretcher, which was carried up and lifted into the interior of the scaffold. The hangman mounted the gallows step, took a large commando-type knife out of a sheath strapped to his side and cut the rope. Von Ribbentrop's limp body with the black hood still over his head was removed to the far end of the room and placed behind a black canvas curtain. This had all taken less than 10 minutes. So after the doctor had looked at the gallows to see whether death had occurred, the bodies were taken away to a different room, where coffins had been laid out for all those who had been sentenced to death. The bodies were placed directly onto the coffin, and these coffins had a flat lid, which allowed the men to be placed easily on top of. They also had what appeared to be a blanket placed under their heads to allow them to be propped up. The noose was also cut in a way that, on many of the bodies, the rope was still left around the neck. There was no attempt to remove this noose at all from some of the bodies. The men were all on their coffins wearing the clothes they were executed in, and some had stranger fates than others. The scene of the dead bodies was very morbid, and some of the men, including Wilhelm and Wilhelm Keitel, were covered in their own blood. As they went through the gallows, the trapdoor smashed them in the face, leaving their heads bleeding profusely. These men were propped up with a white pillow under their heads also, and it showed the gruesome final seconds of their life. They all had their death expression on the faces, and also placed on his coffin was Hermann Göring, who did not go through the gallows, but instead consumed cyanide hours before the execution was due to take place. Regarding the coffins specifically, they appear to be just rectangular boxes, and are not traditional coffin shapes. They look made from thick wood, and after the images of the men were taken, the bodies were then placed inside of the coffins. Presumably the nooses which were still wrapped around some of the necks of the men were left too, and were then placed in the coffins with them. There was no preparation of the remains at all, no embalming or anything, and the bodies were just placed in the coffins as they were. These were then left inside of the prison until the evening of the 17th of October 1946. The Americans gathered an extra coffin to make it appear that they did not have the Nuremberg defendants in their possession, and one by one the coffins of the executed were lifted onto the back of a US Army truck, and they were to be dealt with once and for all. Interestingly, the Americans had gone to great lengths to hide what they were actually doing, cremating the remains of the Nuremberg Nazis, and specifically, they hid who was inside the coffin. They were obviously going to cremate the remains, but they placed markings on the coffins that tried to trick anyone that these were not the Nuremberg Nazis. For example, Hermann Göring's coffin was labelled as George Munger, with George Munger actually being a well-known head coach of the University of Pennsylvania's football team. This is something Americans would know, but Germans would have no clue. The Americans did this so there was not a huge spectacle made of them dealing with the bodies of these Nazis. They were weary of facing hostility too. Under nightfall, the coffins with their false names were driven to Munich and to the Erstfriedhof, a graveyard and cemetery which also has a crematoria inside. The now 12 coffins, remember the extra one that had been brought to throw people off the scent when they arrived at the crematoria, were all burned one by one. The Germans who operated the crematory were told that the coffins were of American soldiers, but one by one, without asking questions, the staff burned the coffins and the corpses of the executed Nuremberg Nazis. The US soldiers would have got the coffins off the back of the trucks and then lifted them towards a crematoria oven. It would have taken a while to do this and burn the bodies, as the bodies were not instantly incinerated as with a cremation, and it probably took all night to get rid of the remains and coffins properly. After the job had been done, the ashes of the Nuremberg Nazis were swept up and collected, and these were all then disposed of, being scattered in the river Isar. The coffins of the Nuremberg Nazis were large and huge, and the Americans had planned out meticulously what they were going to do with the remains. They even ensured that the coffins had handles on the side for soldiers to then lift the coffins onto trucks and then off them. The operation to deal with the remains was understandably very secretive, and as mentioned, little preparation of the remains occurred, meaning that over the course of the day that they were left inside the coffin, the remains may have actually begun to smell and partially decompose. But the Nuremberg executions, no matter if you see them as a failure on the part of the executioner or not, did succeed in bringing some of the worst war criminals to their fates. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.